Yale University Art Gallery Collection Sharing Initiative. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's a Mellon-funded initiative that is really a pilot project to explore the potential of sharing collections for the purpose of teaching within the college curriculum. At the very beginning, the Mellon Foundation invited together representatives from a number of college and university art museums who had been working very hard on their teaching programs over the last 2 decades. And the question they posed to this group was, what could help you bring your teaching program to the next level?
One of the things that we've done that's very different than other museums since the very beginning is to privilege taking works out of storage for students to study. When Yale offered us this opportunity to do a collection sharing initiative, we immediately thought about ancient art, not only because we have very superb professors who are working this area in a number of different departments, but also because this is an area where we actually don't have much to offer them, as much as we would like.
Most of the teaching we do at Dartmouth in terms of classical archaeology is done with visual material. So we're using, of course, slides and now PowerPoint presentations and digital imagery of these objects, sometimes video, but most of it is all done in a classroom and projected on a screen. So it's really important for our teaching and for talking about these objects for students to come to the Hood Museum and be able to look at these objects. They're not behind a glass panel. They can look at them from all sides. They can do everything but touch them.
We're interested in students looking at the original objects without the intermediary of scholarship, so that they're asked to think through the issues themselves and to develop their critical thinking skills. And having the objects on campus makes a huge difference, in part because the objects are three-dimensional objects, and no matter what sort of images we give them, and no matter how good those images are, it's very difficult to understand the object as an entirety without being able to see it and to walk around it. What it does is give them a much clearer sense emotionally that these objects represent a whole group of people who thought and understood the world in a certain way, and these objects reflect the way people understood the world. So the artist is not representing reality in any precise sense. Right? No one reproduces reality exactly when they're doing a piece of art. What we have is their view on the world and what they understood to be important. And so these objects give us a window into the way Greeks thought about things, at least the way they organized the world around them. And so having those objects in front of them makes it a lot more powerful for the students. Even a short visit to the museum to see some objects makes a big difference in terms of the way the students understand and invest themselves in the material.
When we become professors, of course, we cannot bring our students around the world to see the individual objects that each one of us studies in our classes. So having, through the Hood Museum in this case at Dartmouth, that possibility of encountering a certain sample of works of art is a very important aspect of how we, in turn, convey that point to our students.
Actually interacting with the objects firsthand really was amazing, and definitely taught me that close-up examination of objects in person makes all the difference. It's not like looking at a photograph on the internet.
It's often quite magical what happens in these sessions because the students are able to experience the work of art in such an intimate way. It grounds the ideas in history and in materiality in a way that makes the ideas that they're studying in the course very, very real and very particular.
During the 3 years of the Yale loan, we had a different intern for each year working with the Yale objects. We immediately thought of our internship program because we provide opportunities for our interns to work directly with objects, and we also enable them to work on a small exhibition called Space for Dialogues, Fresh Perspectives on the Permanent Collection by Dartmouth students. So they do everything from select the objects to think about the wall color, to write the labels and brochure. They also give a gallery talk at the end of the run of the exhibition.
I'm particularly interested in classics
It's my field of study, and luckily we have a loan from Yale right now with a lot of really great pieces. I settled on portraiture since it's such an interesting topic and is manifested in a lot of different ways. So I'm showing here sculpture as well as painting and coins, so different ways in which portraits were displayed and interacted with in the ancient world.
The thesis of my Space for Dialogue, the theme that I was really interested in looking at was this theme of cultural hybridity in provincial Roman artwork. We have a lot of works from the Roman provinces in the Yale loan, and I was really interested in looking at sort of how indigenous local cultures intersected with the imperial Roman cultures.
The reason that I called my exhibit Beyond Aphrodite, Interpreting Portrayals of Real Women in Ancient Greece is because a lot of the time in ancient art, we are bombarded with images of goddesses. We see Athena in a variety of contexts. We see Aphrodite, who is the goddess of love, over and over and over again. Yet, a lot of the time, we don't see images of real women or the everyday woman. What we can learn from these representations is that females were depicted differently in ancient art, and often the function of the object can reveal sort of how the image of that woman was supposed to be interpreted in that context.
When they're through with this project, then they have this wonderful product and they have this experience that they can go, after Dartmouth, they can go and use it to sort of get other internships or apply for other jobs. And a lot of our interns have gone on in the museum business, and I think the Space for Dialogue plays a critical role that way.
Last summer we had the idea of perhaps taking advantage of some of the material that Yale had loaned to the Hood Museum and have students work with some of the material while they're in Italy. For the students who had been on campus before we left for Italy that summer before, some of them came to the Hood Museum and were able to look at this object themselves. And for those students who couldn't, we had high quality photographs, and I simply, one day in Rome, I gave them a series of images of this object, and I turned them loose in the museums and said, see what you can find out.
The nice thing about the Romans is that the emperors had a lot of portraits done of themselves. So it was really sort of connecting an imperial trend in portraiture to this unknown head and figuring out where it sat. So I dated him around 240. And the big reason that I did that is because I found a bust in the Monte Martini Museum that shared a lot of the same features. It had a similar sort of turn of the head, very slight. There was a little bit of a beard on both of the men, certainly not as full bearded as Hadrian or Caracalla was. So using those clues and using this particular bust from the Monte Martini Museum, which is interestingly of an unknown person, but they did have a definitive date for that one. So that was really helpful.
Wherever we were going, wherever we were looking, we were always trying to find another portrait head, another clue that could sort of confirm our ideas.
I was really pleased to see some of the conclusions the students came up with. I think if we look at some of the papers they wrote and some of their own statements, it's really quite striking how many of them came to very similar conclusions. The types of activities they were engaged in are the same types of activities that museum curators, classical archaeologists, and scholars work with to identify new works of art that we don't know much about.
And I think that made our studies a lot more interesting, and I think that was something I really enjoy now when I go to museums and I look at objects and try to figure out how do people know what they know about them.
I was particularly interested in the opportunity of getting some of the coins from Yale to complement our own collection and create a series of assignments for my history students. I'm interested in the coinage because it creates the closest thing we have to a continuous record from antiquity. Coins are minted every year. Their iconography changes every year. So the symbols were changing regularly. And one has the possibility to track basic ideas over time through this medium. So there's this potential value to interpret these value-laden objects, small as they are, and think about what the Roman government was trying to say to people as it maintained coherence, as it kept people inspired to do their jobs. And the Romans help us a lot because they use, value-laden symbols. They use images. Many of them were nervous, and some of them scoffed. How could you spend an entire term researching a coin? What could a coin possibly do? But they really got into it because what they realized was that antiquity was speaking to them. I broke down my assignment and they wrote their description, so they learned how to look closely and describe an artifact precisely. You let the coins speak first. You don't say, I have history, how does the coin fit? You say, I have coins with a certain symbol. And you try to establish its contexts using other visual media. And this is what I was having the students do. And the hard part is you have this close relationship with an artifact and you figure out the symbology of the artifact. And then they have to write history. That's the hard part. That's the great experience. Turning in their papers, several of them said to me, I had no idea what an object could teach me. These papers are first rate, and they're first rate because the object brings out that intellectual energy, that desire to know, and that desire to understand.
The course I took for this particular assignment was Art of Ancient Greece. And one of the things that our professor asked us to do was to look at the artwork on loan from the Yale collection and pick one that interested us and that we could explore in some way that we felt would be interesting.
I asked them first to pay close attention to the object of their choice and try to describe it, try to articulate what it was that they were seeing. A process that is deceptively simple, but is actually rather complicated when one tries to do it in a systematic way. I then asked them to go out and do some research about the theme that was depicted on their chosen vase. I thought it was very important for the students to understand that there are a lot of things that we do know and can know through the study of these vases about what it is that they depict. Because, of course, one of the unusual aspects of Greek vases is that, unlike vases in other cultures and other periods, they have narratives, they have figures, and as opposed to abstract representations, and therefore they have something that calls for interpretation. But I also wanted them to realize that there's a lot of things that we do not know about the broader significance of what it is that we are seeing. And I wanted them to engage with some of that uncertainty, which is often uncomfortable for students to confront. And I also wanted them to read scholarship from a variety of angles, not only to understand the fact that not everybody agrees on what vases exactly show and what is going on, but also that this is a way for them to insert themselves into the scholarly dialogue, because ultimately when you come to write your own paper as a student or as a scholar, you have to take some position simply by virtue of the fact of how you organize the material, how you reconcile contradictions, and things of this sort. And that was important, I think, for students to realize not only what we know, which is quite significant, but also what we don't know and we continue to be thinking about.
We really got to design our own set of problems and pick our own topic that we would really be interested in. So not only do we have a choice of vases where we could come and look and examine them and then be drawn to a particular one, but then also we could develop the questions we wanted to ask about that vase and really explore how we wanted to go about our study, whether or not we wanted to focus strictly on imagery or whether or not we wanted to bring in historical context. And someone who has worked in history and art history and things like that, this was a great opportunity provided to me to really meld some of my interest in a really interesting topic. This particular vase type is known as a large column crater, and it would have been used in the symposium setting or drinking parties, largely all male gatherings and things like that. The particular image on this scene is what is known as a pederastic scene, or a courtship scene between an older man and a younger boy or adolescent. The main figures on this vase are the Orestes, who is the older and the bearded figure depicted in most of pederastic courtship scenes, and then you have the youth who is being pursued or courted, and that is the eromenos. One of the most important ways of initiating a relationship is through gift giving, and on this vase we have two very clear examples of that. On the one hand, we have the giving of the hair, which scholars have thought is a sort of a pedagogical gift, whereby giving a hair has something to do with a hunting connotation. Now, on the other hand, we have the Orestes giving his eromenos what looks to be sort of a small ball or pouch. It's been thought to either be a pouch of money, but that's been discredited because that would be sort of a form of prostitution or love in exchange for money. But more likely, it's what is known as a stragoloi, which is a small pouch of like animal bones or knuckle bones, which is a game that a youth would play, and that would be a proper gift that an elder Orestes could give to an eromenos. One of the problematic aspects about studying Greek courtship scenes, especially with regard to pederasty, is that it's certainly not something that's socially acceptable today. And one of the things you have to do when studying a vase like this is sort of look at the historical context and what Greek pederasty meant for the Greeks at the time, and how it sort of functioned as a socially sanctioned relationship. The two dominant scholarly streams of thought on that is, on the one hand, that Greek pederasty was a relationship based on more sexual characteristics and sort of the idea of a dominant versus a passive partner. But recently, more scholars have been more interested in the idea that how was an eromenos being an active role in the relationship, and was it strictly a dominant passive relationship? And I think one of the things this vase clearly shows and it points in the direction of is that this dominant passive strict dichotomy does not seem to really hold, especially when you have a courtship scene and the eromenos is left to decide which Orestes he is going to go for, or which gift that he finds preferable. I mean, what's really astonishing about the Greek pederastic scene is just how common it was. It was on all sorts of different types of pottery, definitely on large column craters, which would have been in the symposium and the gymnasium. And especially the courtship scene, among the pederastic scenes depicted on vases, it was the most common. So again, this leads to the questions of how important this was to society, or why was it so important, and why were the conventions so commonly depicted in Greek art.
At the Hood, we work with faculty from many different types of disciplines. And I think that's because we have come to understand in working with our own collections that objects are manifestations about how a culture and a society thinks about many different types of topics. And when you're working with a particularly interesting work of art, you often can come at it from many different types of angles and ask different types of questions. A historian might be looking at how a particular ruler is looking at how he's conveying his image, or how his power is represented. An art historian might be looking at how the iconography of the object or its use might convey about the culture.
As we discussed the loans, it was wonderful to sit around the table and say, what are our themes? And each of us immediately could point to an object that they understood to express that theme. And my goodness, we have a different skill set. They create many of the same statements. We make many of the same claims, but with a completely different toolbox. They just have a different skill set. That's what this Yale loan is allowing the campus to see.
To really see something in all its complexity from looking at it very, very carefully. It's great training for their self-expression, in addition to great training for simply their ability to observe.
Well, I think we're still learning what may come of this, for sure. The big hope is that the relationships among colleagues will continue to develop and will extend far beyond the duration of any one of these projects. It's much better for all of our collections to be accessible and to be integrated into teaching. And so if there is a way to foster a more nimble exchange of works of art that pertain to trends in a given college's curriculum in a given year, then that would be a great contribution to the field of academic art museums.